Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Western Flavors. Before we begin, we must process the heartbreaking and deeply treacherous events of our last episode. The battle for Heartland's future began in earnest, with two and opposing campaigns taking shape. While Amy and Ty secured their first tangible victory for their community-led rebuild, a gift of a reclaimed lumber that validated their entire faith-based approach, Tim was moving his own and very different pieces around the board. He presented Lou with a slick and seductive developer's proposal, systematically breaking down her resistance with the sheer and brutal logic of his numbers. The episode ended on a soul-crushing cliffhanger. Amy, Ty, and Caleb, in the midst of their hopeful work at the ruins, watching in stunned horror as Tim and Lou personally escorted the developer, a stranger and an invader, onto the sacred ground of the North Pasture. The hypothetical war has just become terrifyingly real. The world, for a long and terrible and silent moment, seemed to hold its breath. From their vantage point amidst the sacred and familiar ruins of their home, Amy, Ty, and Caleb stood as frozen as statues, watching the unbelievable and profane and deeply treacherous scene unfold across the valley. The developer's gleaming and alien truck was a wound on the landscape, and the sight of her father and of her sister standing beside it, welcoming this vulture onto their land, was a wound in Amy's soul. The initial and disbelieving shock that had paralyzed her began to burn away, consumed by a fire that was hotter and purer and more powerful than any grief she had ever known. It was the fire of a pure and righteous and incandescent rage. She did not say a word. She did not scream. She simply dropped the old and rusted and deeply beloved iron house number she had just salvaged from the rubble. It landed in the dust with a soft and unheard thud. And then she started to walk. It was not a hesitant walk. It was a march. A steady and relentless and absolutely unstoppable advance, her boots crunching on the gravel of the ranch road, her arms swinging at her sides, her eyes fixed on the three and distant and treacherous figures by the fence line. She was a soldier crossing a no-man's land to face the enemy. Caleb took a step forward, his own face a mask of a grim and worried disbelief.
Amy! Whoa! Hang on a second.
But Ty put a hand on his arm, stopping him. Ty knew his wife. He knew that look in her eyes. This was not a fire that could be contained. It could only be aimed.
We'd better go with her.
His voice was a low and heavy and deeply resigned thing. He and Caleb fell into step a few paces behind her, not as a restraint, but as a reinforcement, her honor guard, her witnesses. The three figures at the fence line saw them coming. Tim's expression soured, his face darkening with a pure and unadulterated and paternalistic annoyance. This was an interruption, an inconvenience, an unprofessional and deeply embarrassing complication. Lou's face, however, went pale with a pure and unadulterated and childish panic. She looked like a trapped animal, desperate to run but with nowhere to go. And the developer, Rick Fennell, simply watched their approach with a cool and detached and faintly amused curiosity. This was just another part of the game. Amy did not stop her relentless march until the rough and weathered and familiar wood of the pasture fence was pressing against her hips. She did not look at her father. She did not look at the developer. She looked only and directly and with the full and terrible and heartbreaking force of her betrayal at her sister.
What is he doing here, Lou?
Her voice was a low and shaking and terribly quiet thing, a sound that was far more menacing than any scream. Lou flinched, her eyes darting nervously from Amy's burning gaze to Tim's thunderous face.
Amy, this is Rick Fennell. He's a land consultant. We were just looking. It's just a preliminary survey. It's just a conversation.
Amy, calm down.
Tim stepped forward, inserting himself between the two sisters, his voice dripping with a forced and condescending and utterly infuriating patience. He was the adult, managing the overwrought emotions of a child.
You are making a scene. Rick, I sincerely apologize for this. A slight family disagreement. We can continue this back at the lodge.
Rick Fennell's lips curved into a slight and slick and deeply condescending smirk. He looked Amy up and down, taking in her dusty and work-worn clothes and her furious and tear-streaked face with the detached amusement of a biologist studying a particularly agitated and primitive specimen. No problem at all, Tim. I get it. There are always a few emotional hurdles to clear with these legacy properties. The family attachment can be... The word emotional, so casual, so dismissive, so clinically patronizing, was the final spark.
Emotional?
She finally looked at him, her eyes blazing with a fire that made the slick developer take an involuntary step back.
You think this is emotional? You walk onto our home with your slick suit and your plans to pave over my grandfather's entire life, and you think this is about emotion. This is our home. This is our legacy. It is not a property, and it is not for sale.
That is enough, Amy.
Tim's voice was a sharp and angry and commanding bark.
You are being hysterical, and you are embarrassing this entire family.
Hysterical. It was the word that broke her. It was the ultimate dismissal, the ultimate invalidation of her grief, her love, her principles. The last, and frayed, and fragile thread of her control finally and completely and spectacularly snapped.
Hysterical?
Her voice rose, a raw and wounded and powerful and magnificent cry of a pure and righteous fury.
I am standing here on my own land, watching my own father and my own sister conspire with this vulture to pick apart our home, to sell off our memories, to spit on the grave of the best man I have ever known, and you have the nerve to tell me that I am being hysterical.
She took a step forward, her entire body trembling with the force of her rage. She looked past her father, past her sister, her gaze locking onto Rick Fennel, and her eyes held a cold and hard and absolute authority that he had never before encountered in any boardroom. It was the ancient and unshakable and terrifying authority of a person defending their sacred ground.
Get off our land.
The words were quiet, but they cut through the air with the force and the finality of a guillotine. Fennel's smirk finally and completely vanished, replaced by a look of a stunned and offended disbelief. Amy's voice rose, stronger and harder, and completely and utterly and unshakably certain.
Now.
The developer stared at her for a long and silent moment. He was a man who was used to getting his own way, a man who believed that everything and everyone had a price. But the look in this woman's eyes was something new. It was something ancient. It was something that his money and his charm and his power could not touch. He finally broke eye contact, turning to Tim with a single and elegantly raised and deeply annoyed eyebrow. Tom, it seems you have a few things to sort out here. Why don't you give me a call when you have your house in order? He did not wait for a reply. He gave Amy one last and lingering and deeply contemptuous look. Then he turned, and with a slow and deliberate and deeply insulted stride, he walked back to his gleaming black truck, got in and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a deep and ugly and terrible silence in his wake. The four of them, Tim, Lou, Amy, and Ty, were left standing in the terrible and raw and ugly and profoundly silent aftermath. The buffer of the stranger was gone, and there was nothing left between them but their own and new and gaping and mortally wounded family ties. Tim turned on Amy, his face a mask of a pure and impotent and sputtering rage.
Are you happy now? Are you satisfied? You just blew the one and only chance we had to save this family.
Amy stared back at him, her own face a pale and tear-streaked and utterly and completely and heartbreakingly unforgiving mask.
If that's what it takes to save this family, Dad, then I would rather stand here and watch it all burn to the ground.
She turned her back on him and on her sobbing sister, and without another word she began the long and lonely and terribly resolute walk back to the ruins of her home. The battle had been joined, the first shots had been fired, and the war for Heartland had, finally and truly and tragically begun. The short and silent and deeply hostile walk back from the fence line to the Dude Ranch Lodge was a journey across a newly scorched earth. They moved in two and separate and mutually antagonistic formations. Amy, Ty, and Caleb walked in a tight and unified and furiously silent group, their shared outrage a palpable and protective shield around them. Several yards behind, Tim and Lou followed, a miserable and fractured and defeated army of two, the terrible and unspoken recriminations already a poisonous and heavy and unbreathable cloud between them. The beautiful and crisp and hopeful morning had been completely and irrevocably and tragically shattered. They reconvened in the main room of the lodge, the familiar and comfortable space, now feeling as small and as claustrophobic and as dangerously charged as a boxing ring. No one sat down. They remained on their feet, squaring off the raw and adrenaline-fueled and deeply uncivilized energy of the public confrontation, carrying over into the private sphere, where the fight could become even more vicious and even more personal. Tim, as always, threw the first punch. He was pacing back and forth in front of the cold hearth, his hands clenched into a tight and white-knuckled and impotent fists, his face a mask of a pure and sputtering and deeply aggrieved fury.
Do you have any idea? Any idea at all? What you have just done?
He directed the question at Amy, his voice a low and dangerous and trembling growl.
You didn't just chase away a potential business partner. You chased away our only lifeline. You stood there, in the middle of our own property, and you threw a childish and embarrassing and completely hysterical tantrum in front of a professional man who was offering to save us from complete and utter ruin. You humiliated me. You humiliated your sister. You humiliated this entire family.
Amy, who had been standing with her back to him, staring out the window, her entire body rigid with a contained rage, spun around to face him.
A businessman? I saw a wolf, Dad, and you and Lou were standing there holding the gate to the sheep pen wide open for him. He wasn't offering to save us. He was offering to buy Grandpa's soul, and you were both standing there smiling, ready to hand it over to him for a commission.
It was a clean exit, a financial solution to a financial problem.
This is not a financial problem. This is a moral problem. It's a test of who we are, of what we believe in, of what Grandpa taught us. And you are both failing that test.
The argument was a brutal and ugly and deeply circular thing, a rehashing of the same and irreconcilable and now mortally wounded positions. They were past the point of a listening, past the point of a reason. They were just two and opposing and deeply entrenched forces firing their last and most painful and most damaging volleys of a blame and a betrayal across a battlefield that had once been their living room. And then their focus shifted, like two and warring generals. They both, at the exact same moment, turned their full and considerable and desperate attention to the one and undecided and deeply crucial territory that lay between them. Lou. She stood, pale and trembling, and utterly and completely and miserably trapped in the crossfire. Tim was the first to appeal to her, his voice a sharp and urgent and deeply coercive plea for a logic and a reason.
Lou, for God's sake, make her see reason. You are the one with the business degree. You saw the numbers from the bank. You saw the proposal. It is a clean and simple and guaranteed path to our survival. Are you really going to stand there and let her condemn this entire family to bankruptcy because she is too sentimental to part with a single and unused field? Tell her that she is wrong.
Amy then turned to her, her own voice no longer angry, but a low and pleading and deeply and terribly and heartbreakingly wounded cry for a loyalty and for a memory and for a sisterhood.
Lou, look at me. Please, this is me. This is your sister. Remember when we were little girls? Remember what Grandpa taught us about this place, about what was really important. That man, Lou, that plan, it is a betrayal of everything he ever stood for, everything he ever was. Don't do this to him. Don't do this to us. Please, don't stand with him. Stand with me. Stand with Grandpa.
She was being pulled apart. The two and most powerful and most important and most beloved forces in her entire life were demanding that she choose between them. Her father's terrifying and inescapable and brutally logical reality versus her sister's beautiful and passionate and sacred and seemingly impossible idealism. The pressure, the weight, the sheer and unadulterated and soul-crushing agony of the choice became a physical thing, a crushing weight in her chest, a screaming in her ears, and she finally and completely and irrevocably broke.
Stop it!
Her voice was a raw and ragged and guttural and unrecognizable scream of a pure and unadulterated and absolute and final anguish.
Just, both of you, stop it.
She looked from Amy's pleading and tear-streaked and beautiful face to her father's desperate and angry and demanding one, and her own face, the face of the woman who had always been so composed, so in control, so capable, completely and utterly crumbled.
What do you want from me, Amy?
The words were a torrent, a flood of a pain and of a fear and of a resentment and of a pitiable and agonizing and soul-crushing clarity.
I look at you, and I hear Grandpa's voice. I see his heart. I see everything that I have ever loved in this entire world. But when I look at the calendar, I see a deadline that is getting closer every single day. When I look at our bank account, I see nothing. And when I listen to Dad, I hear a plan.
She was openly sobbing now, the tears streaming down her face, a woman being ripped in two in a real time.
It is a horrible plan. I hate it. I hate that man. I hate those papers. I hate everything about it. But it is the only plan we have. It is the only thing that stands between us and losing everything forever. Your plan. It's beautiful, but it's a prayer, and I don't think a prayer is going to be enough to save us.
She took a deep and shuddering and final and life-altering breath, and she made her choice.
I am sorry, Amy. I am so sorry. But I see that we are on a sinking ship, and he is the only one who is holding a life raft. I have to choose survival. I choose his plan.
The declaration, a final and complete and agonizing surrender to the forces of a fear and a pragmatism, landed in the silent room with the force and the finality of a death knell. It was over. The choice had been made. Amy stared at her sister, and the look on her face was one of a pure and profound and absolute and shattered heartbreak. The loss of her sister, the final and definitive and irrevocable betrayal, was a far deeper and more mortal wound than her father's predictable and consistent and lifelong opposition. She had lost her. She had truly and completely lost her. Tim did not look triumphant. He looked grim, and he looked tired, and he looked for a single and unguarded and fleeting moment, deeply and profoundly and terribly ashamed of the brutal and ugly and Pyrrhic victory that he had just won at such an unimaginable and catastrophic cost. It was Ty who finally moved. He stepped forward, and he put his arm around Amy's shaking shoulders, pulling her into his side, a solid and unwavering and absolute wall of a support. His own voice, when he spoke, was a quiet and cold and terribly clear and unforgiving thing.
Okay? Then I guess we know where we all stand.
The words were not a question. They were a judgment. They were a line drawn in the sand. The two factions were now, and officially and irrevocably cemented. It was Amy and Ty on one side, a small and heartbroken and principled and defiant island of a memory and a faith. And it was Tim and Lou on the other, a powerful and pragmatic and miserable and now deeply and terribly and guilt-ridden alliance of a fear and a survival. They were all staring at each other from across the vast and silent and newly formed, and now completely and utterly and impassably wide chasm that had once been their family. And everyone in that room knew, with a terrible and absolute and soul-crushing certainty, that there was no going back. The silence that followed Lou's agonizing confession was a terrible and profound and absolute thing. It was the silence of a final and fatal and irrevocable choice having been made. The air in the room was thick with the ghosts of what had just been lost, the ghost of a sisterhood, the ghost of a trust, the ghost of a family that had, for a brief and beautiful and shining moment after Jack's funeral, been whole. Amy stood, held upright only by the steady and anchoring presence of Ty's arm around her, her face a mask of a pure and shattered and disbelieving heartbreak. This was a wound far deeper than any argument with her father. This was a betrayal from within. It was Amy who finally broke the silence. She slowly and deliberately pulled away from Ty's supportive embrace. She stood on her own, and in that simple and physical act, a profound and terrible and powerful transformation took place. The heartbroken and pleading and desperate younger sister vanished, and in her place stood a queen. A cold and resolute and deeply wounded queen whose sacred duty was now to defend her borders against the traitors within her own court. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer emotional. It was a flat and calm and terribly clear and unforgiving thing, the voice of an adversary stating the new and unchangeable terms of a war.
So that's it then.
She did not look at her father. She looked only at Lou, her gaze a steady and piercing and deeply and terribly and sorrowfully disappointed thing.
You're really going to do it. You're going to stand with him and sell Grandpa's land.
It was not a question, it was a final and sad and deeply damning verdict. Before Lou could even attempt to stammer out a defense, a justification, a plea for an understanding, Amy continued, her voice gaining a cold and hard and powerful strength.
Then you both need to understand something. We are not a part of this. We are not your partners in this desecration. We will not help you. We will not sign a single one of your papers, and we will fight you.
She took a step forward, her presence suddenly and shockingly formidable.
We will fight you every single step of the way, with every dollar we have, with every friend we can find. The people in this valley, the people who actually knew and loved Grandpa, they are on our side. You are not just fighting me anymore, Dad. You are not just fighting Ty. You are fighting his entire life. You are fighting his entire legacy.
Tim opened his mouth to retort, a sharp and angry and dismissive comment already forming on his lips, but Amy held up a hand, a gesture of a such and sudden and absolute authority that he was shocked into a silence. She was not finished, and the final and most devastating blow was yet to come. She turned her gaze back to her sister. The coldness in her eyes softened for a single and heartbreaking moment, replaced by a wave of a such and profound and deep and ancient sorrow that it was more painful than any anger could ever be.
We are going to rebuild our home, Lou. The real home. Ty and I and Caleb and anyone else who actually remembers what this family is supposed to be about. We are going to rebuild it the Heartland way, with our own hands and with our own sweat, and with the help of a people who understand that this place is more than just a piece of a real estate.
She paused, and her voice, when she spoke again, was a quiet and steady and terribly sad and utterly and completely and irrevocably final whisper.
And I want you to know, right now, so that you are perfectly clear on the consequences of your choice, that as long as you are a part of his plan, as long as you are actively trying to sell Grandpa's land, you will not be welcome in my home.
The words, a quiet and surgical and devastating emotional blow, landed with a pinpoint and brutal and absolute accuracy. Lou let out a small and choked and strangled sound as if all the air had been stolen from her lungs. The idea of a being exiled from the future Heartland, the home of her childhood, the very center of her entire world, was a torment, a consequence, a price that she had not in her terrified and pragmatic and desperate calculations ever truly considered. Tim, completely deaf to the profound and emotional and deeply catastrophic wound that had just been inflicted, let out a rough and dismissive scoff.
Don't be so dramatic, Amy. There won't be a home for you to be unwelcome in. If you get your way, we'll all be bankrupt.
But Amy was no longer listening to him. She was no longer even in a conversation with him. She had made her declaration, and now it was Ty's turn. He stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with his wife, a silent and powerful and unshakable wall of a unity. His face was a grim and hard and serious mask. He was no longer just a husband supporting his wife. He was the patriarch, the man Jack had chosen, and he was about to make his first and official and deeply and terribly and necessary decree. His tone was not emotional, like Amy's. It was formal, and it was steady, and it carried the cold and unmistakable and deeply threatening weight of a
So that there is no confusion moving forward. I am formally stating our position.
He looked directly at Tim and then at Lou, his gaze a clear and unwavering and deeply challenging thing.
As co-trustees of the Bartlett-Fleming Morris Trust, established by the final will and testament of John Bartlett, Amy and I will be exploring our own and separate options to fulfill all the terms of the will as they were written. And to be perfectly clear, we do not, and we will not, under any circumstances consent to any sale, lease, or subdivision of the property held within that trust.
He let the words hang in the air for a long and heavy and deeply significant moment before delivering the final and most crucial part of his declaration.
Any attempt to move forward with such a plan without our unanimous consent will be met with an immediate and appropriate and very serious legal challenge.
The threat, so clear, so calm, so absolute, transformed the very nature of the conflict. This was no longer just a messy and painful and heartbreaking family feud. He had just, with a few and carefully chosen and brutally effective words, turned it into a formal and adversarial and potentially and very ugly legal dispute. He had declared war not just in the living room, but in a future courtroom. Tim stared at him, his face a mask of a pure and unadulterated and sputtering disbelief and a rage.
Are you threatening to sue us? You're going to sue your own family?
Ty did not flinch. His gaze was as hard and as cold and as unmoving as a stone.
We will do whatever it takes to protect Jack's legacy.
The finality of his words, the quiet and absolute and unshakable resolve behind them was the end of the argument. The hope for a reconciliation, for a compromise, for any kind of a peace was now completely and utterly and irrevocably dead. The two factions stood on their opposite sides of the room, the battle lines now drawn not just with a pain and a betrayal, but with the cold and hard and unforgiving ink of a law. On one side stood Amy and Ty, a united and resolute and deeply wounded front, the self-appointed guardians of a sacred trust, and on the other stood Tim and Lou, a miserable and frightened, and now deeply and terribly and inseparably allied, partnership of a pragmatism and a fear. They were a family in a name only, and they were all now standing in the silent and terrible and deeply unhappy ruins of the love that had once bound them all together. The war had been declared, the lines had been drawn, and the great and beautiful and welcoming lodge of the Fairfield Dude Ranch had become a cold and silent and miserable occupied territory. In the immediate and stunned and deeply unhappy aftermath of Ty's legal ultimatum, the two and newly formed and bitterly opposed factions retreated to their respective corners, the vast and open-plan living space now a silent and invisible and fiercely guarded border between them. Tim was a storm of a furious and impotent and deeply insulted rage. He paced the floor in front of the cold hearth, his movements the agitated and restless and repetitive circles of a caged and newly wounded animal.
Can you believe the audacity, the sheer and unmitigated gall? He's going to sue us? His own family? After everything I am doing to save them from themselves, he is going to stand there and threaten me with lawyers?
Lou sat huddled in one of the large armchairs, a small and miserable and deeply broken figure. The legal threat had transformed her choice from a heartbreaking but necessary business decision into something far more terrifying. She was no longer just on the opposite side of an argument from her sister. She was now on the opposite side of a potential and very real and very ugly lawsuit. The weight of that realization was a crushing and physical thing, and she looked as though she might simply collapse in on herself. The poison of the feud, now unleashed, began to spread, forcing the quiet and grieving and neutral parties onto the battlefield. The first to choose her side did so not with a loud declaration, but with a quiet and steady and deeply powerful act of a love and a loyalty. Later that afternoon, Lisa found Ty in the quiet and sun-dappled and peaceful solitude of the main barn. He was methodically cleaning tack, his hands moving with a slow and practiced and steady rhythm. The simple and repetitive and honest work a necessary and calming balm on his frayed and troubled and newly burdened soul. Lisa did not approach him with a drama or with a tears. Her own and deep and profound sorrow had, in the face of Tim's cruelty and the family's subsequent implosion, been forged into a quiet and elegant and unshakable resolve. She carried the full and undeniable weight of her husband's memory, and she was about to bestow it upon his chosen heir. Jack wasn't a fool, Ty. Her voice was a soft and clear and steady thing. Ty stopped his work and turned to face her. He knew Tim's nature, he knew his fears, and he knew his ambitions. He loved him, but he chose you. She took a step closer, her gaze direct and unwavering and full of a deep and absolute and powerful trust. He saw your strength, your patience, your integrity. He saw the man his own granddaughter had chosen, and he knew that you were the one who could be trusted. He trusted you to be the caretaker of his legacy, and so do I. She paused, allowing the profound and heavy and sacred weight of her endorsement to settle over him. It was a coronation, a quiet and simple and profoundly moving anointing of the new patriarch by the widowed queen. This business, the Dude Ranch, Jack left it to me, which means its finances, its resources, they are separate from the Heartland Trust. And I want you and I want Amy to know that those resources are now your resources. This is your home. This is your base of operations. You will not have to worry about a roof over your heads, or about a food on your table, or about the money for a good lawyer while you fight this fight. You will use my strength so that you can focus on yours. Jack would have wanted me to support his chosen heir, and that is what I am going to do. The offer was a staggering and unexpected and deeply and profoundly moving gift. It was not just a financial support, it was a strategic masterstroke. Lisa had just provided Team Amy with a secure and independent and fully funded base from which to wage their war. She had given them the one thing Tim and Lou were most terrified of losing, a security. The next soldier to formally enlist did so with a simple and direct and deeply honorable pledge of an allegiance. Caleb, who had been a silent and grim-faced witness to the entire and ugly and heartbreaking series of confrontations, found Amy and Ty by the corrals, their faces a mask of a weary and exhausted and heartbroken determination.
I just want you both to know.
He was not a man of a fancy speeches. His words were as simple and as solid and as true as the man himself.
What I saw today, what Tim is trying to do, it's just wrong. Jack would have, well, you know what Jack would have thought. It ain't complicated.
He looked from Amy's sad and tired face to Ty's grim and resolute one, and his own expression was one of a pure and simple and unwavering loyalty.
So I'm in, for the whole ride, for whatever you need. My truck, my tools, my time, my back. You're not just my friends anymore. You're the cause. You just tell me where to point the horse.
His simple and heartfelt and absolute declaration of a support was a powerful and necessary and deeply healing infusion of a hope into their wounded and exhausted souls. They were not alone. Their cause was not a lost one. The people who had truly known and truly loved Jack Bartlett were standing with them. With the battle lines now formally and clearly and irrevocably drawn, the physical geography of their lives began to shift. The Dude Ranch Lodge, once a warm and vibrant and unified heart of their family, became a cold and divided and deeply dysfunctional territory. A quiet and unspoken and deeply sad segregation took hold. Mealtimes became the most poignant and heartbreaking and obvious symbol of their new and broken reality. Amy, Ty, and Lisa would eat together, a small and somber and deeply supportive trio at the small round table in the cozy intimacy of the kitchen. Their meals were quiet, but their silence was a comfortable and shared and healing one. And then, an hour later, Tim and Lou would emerge, and they would eat their own and very separate meal at the vast and empty and cavernous dining room table, a lonely and miserable and isolated island of a two. The silence between them a thick and heavy and suffocating blanket of a guilt and of a resentment and of a shared and terrible and lonely burden. They passed each other in the hallways like ghosts, their eyes averted, their faces blank. A conversation would start in the kitchen, and it would immediately and awkwardly die the moment Tim or Lou walked into the room. It was a cold and miserable and deeply and profoundly and utterly unsustainable way to live. The ultimate and most innocent and most heartbreaking casualty of this new and cold and silent war was, of course, Lindy. She moved through the frozen and hostile landscape of her own home with the quiet and watchful and deeply confused and heartbreakingly resilient grace of a child who knew, on some deep and intuitive level, that her world had been shattered but could not understand why. One evening, as Amy was tucking her into bed, she asked the simple and innocent and utterly and completely and devastatingly unanswerable question, "Mommy, why doesn't Auntie Lou talk to us anymore?" The question, so pure, so honest, so full of a genuine and childish and uncomprehending pain, was a dagger in Amy's already bleeding heart. The final and most powerful image of the family's new and broken and terrible reality came late that night. In the vast and dark and silent main room of the lodge, illuminated only by the cold and blue and sterile glow of two laptop screens, sat Tim and Lou. They were not talking, they were working. Tim was studying the developer's proposal, his face a grim and determined and deeply unhappy mask. Lou was scrolling through a dense and complicated and deeply intimidating legal website, researching the arcane and terrible and deeply necessary laws regarding the forced partition and a sale of a property held in a trust. They were a corporate and efficient and miserable and deeply lonely and tragically effective team. And a few rooms away, in the warm and bright and welcoming light of the kitchen, a very different kind of a team was holding its own, and very different kind of a meeting. Amy, Ty, Lisa, and Caleb were gathered around the small kitchen table. The large and hopeful and beautifully naive butcher paper plan was spread out between them, and they were adding to it. They were adding Lisa's offer of a financial support. They were adding Caleb's offer of a time and of a tools and of a loyal and unwavering and deeply committed heart. They were not happy. Their faces were a mask of a sorrow and of exhaustion and of a grim and terrible resolve. But they were united. They were a new kind of a family, a government in an exile, a rebel alliance, forged not by a blood but by a principle, planning their revolution from the very heart of the territory they had lost. And they were ready for the long and difficult and painful and necessary war that was to come. A family war does not begin with a single and deafening cannon shot. It begins in the quiet and in the shadows. It begins with the soft scratch of a pen on a legal pad, with a whispered and clandestine phone call. It begins with the grim and resolute and heartbreaking drawing of a battle lines across a kitchen table. The open and ugly and raw wound of the confrontation at the fence line had now scarred over, and in its place a new and colder and far more dangerous phase of the conflict had begun. The two, and opposing and now formally declared armies had retreated to their camps, and the hard and lonely and deeply unhappy work of waging a war had started in earnest. At the Dude Ranch Lodge, the campaign was one of a paper, and of a whispers, and of the cold and merciless and unforgiving logic of the law. Late into the night, long after the rest of the fractured house had fallen into a restless and troubled sleep, Lou sat at the great dining table, her own face illuminated by the pale and blue and sterile glow of her laptop screen. The table was no longer a place for a family meals. It was her own and very personal and deeply miserable frontline trench. She was surrounded by a scattered and intimidating and deeply esoteric collection of illegal textbooks and printed-out case files. She was not just grieving anymore, she was researching. She was weaponizing her sharp and intelligent and deeply capable mind against her own sister. Her search history was a heartbreaking testament to the terrible and ugly and necessary path she had chosen. Phrases like partition by sale and fiduciary duty of a co-trustees and legal remedies for a trust impasse glowed on the screen. She was meticulously and efficiently, and with a growing and sickening sense of a dread, building the legal case for the forced sale of her own grandfather's land. She was learning how to sue her own family. Her hands were steady as she took notes, her mind a sharp and clear and deeply focused instrument. But a single and silent and terribly sad tear escaped her eye and fell onto the page, smudging the cold and hard and unforgiving ink. In the nearby office, Tim was waging his own and very different kind of a paper war. He was on the phone, his voice a low and smooth and charming and deeply dishonest purr. He was speaking to Rick Fennell, the developer, performing the delicate, necessary, and deeply cynical work of a damage control.
Rick, listen. About yesterday. I can't apologize enough. A family flare-up. You understand. These things can get emotional, sentimental attachments. But I want to reassure you, 100%, that the project is moving forward. My partners are completely on board with the plan. We just need to navigate some of the internal politics. A formality. You know how it is.
He was a masterful salesman, selling a vision of a unified and professional and competent family that he knew, with a deep and painful and sickening certainty, did not exist. He was building their entire future on a foundation of a well-intentioned and desperate and necessary and deeply and profoundly and utterly and completely unforgivable lies. This was their campaign, a quiet and lonely and miserable war, fought with a legal precedence and a corporate spin, and the cold and hard and brutal and undeniable and soul-crushing weight of a numbers. Miles away at the sun-drenched and windswept and beautiful ruin of the old house, a very different kind of a campaign was underway. It was a campaign of a dirt, and of a sweat, and of a tangible and hopeful and deeply defiant action. The first delivery of Mr. Hanley's reclaimed lumber had arrived that morning, and the stacks of old and gray and beautifully seasoned wood stood like a silent and powerful and deeply honorable testament to the enduring power of a community. Amy, Ty, and Caleb were not talking about a war. They were working. The air was filled not with attention, but with the clean and sharp and satisfying sounds of a progress. The rhythmic scrape of a shovels, the sharp twang of a chalk line being snapped against the earth, the easy and comfortable and deeply masculine banter of two men engaged in a hard and honest and meaningful labor. They had cleared the last of the debris from the old foundation, and now, with a set of a simple and hand-drawn and deeply hopeful plan spread out on the hood of Ty's truck, they were staking out the footprint of the new house. It was Ty who retrieved the heavy sledgehammer and the first and sharp and clean and beautifully simple wooden survey stake from the back of his truck. He handed them both to Amy.
The southeast corner.
His voice was a quiet and meaningful and deeply loving thing.
Right where the old porch swing used to hang.
Amy took the heavy hammer in her hands. She walked to the spot, a place of so many memories, a place of summer evenings and of whispered secrets and of her grandfather's quiet and comforting and now impossibly and distant presence. She closed her eyes for a single and fleeting and powerful moment, and then she opened them, and her gaze was clear and hard and full of a fierce and unwavering and absolute and defiant purpose. She lifted the sledgehammer, and she brought it down. The sound of the steel hitting the wood, a sharp and loud and clean and deeply satisfying thud, was the first note in a new and hopeful and powerful and defiant symphony. It was the sound of something being built, not destroyed. It was the sound of a promise being kept. It was the sound of a faith being made manifest in the hard and unforgiving and beautiful and sacred earth of a heartland. She struck the stake again and again, the rhythmic and powerful and cathartic act of a creation, a balm on her wounded soul. It was into this scene of a hopeful and beautiful and sacred labor that Lisa arrived. She walked from her car, carrying not illegal briefs or a corporate proposals, but a large and steaming thermos of a coffee and a basket of a thick and hand-cut and deeply comforting sandwiches. She was not just a supporter, she was a quartermaster, providing the simple and necessary and loving sustenance for her new and small and deeply beloved army. She stood and watched them for a long moment, a small and sad and deeply and profoundly and fiercely proud smile on her face. Your grandfather would be proud. Her voice was a quiet and simple and absolute benediction. This is how he would have done it. The episode concluded with a final and powerful and deeply poignant montage, a visual testament to the two and separate and warring and now completely and utterly irreconcilable realities of the Bartlett-Fleming family. The camera showed Lou, alone in the vast and dark and silent lodge, her face illuminated by the cold and sterile and blue light of her computer screen as her finger traced a line of a dense and unforgiving legal text. Then it showed Amy, her face dirty, her hands calloused, wiping a bead of a sweat from her brow with the back of her arm, her own features illuminated by the warm and golden and honest light of the afternoon sun. Then it showed Tim pacing in his office, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a smooth and confident and deeply persuasive instrument of a commerce, selling a future that was not his to sell. Then it showed Ty and Caleb working together, sharing a joke as they lifted a heavy and ancient and beautiful and deeply honorable beam of a reclaimed wood into place. The final shot of the episode was a long and slow and deeply and terribly and sadly beautiful pullback. It showed the entire and vast and wounded landscape of a heartland. In one corner of the frame, the quiet and isolated and shadowy Dude Ranch Lodge, a place of secrets and of illegal plots and of a terrible and lonely and miserable war of a paper. And in the other, far across the fields, the small and defiant and united group of three working in the bright and open and honest sunlight, their newly hammered stakes forming the clear and hopeful and deeply and profoundly and beautifully defiant outline of the home they were determined to build. The two fronts had been established, the war had begun,